Each man hurried, till they drew near, where William and his darling were lying together. This is a quote from William and the Werewolf, a French poem from 1375, and the Oxford Dictionary's earliest record of they being used for a singular subject. Today, we're starting to see singular they popping up more and more, from being a gender-neutral pronoun set to being Merriam-Webster's word of the year in 2019. And yet, some controversy around its use still looms over many communities. In this video, I'll be discussing the history of the usage of they, them, their as pronouns, non-binary identities, and other cultural approaches to gender as a whole. Among the William the Werewolf quote, there are some other historical pieces of literature indicating the use of singular they. From Geoffrey Chaucer's book The Canterbury Tales to Shakespeare's Hamlet, they has been used to describe and talk about a singular subject in numerous pieces of literature. In the 17th century, scholars began questioning and challenging this because they thought that having a word that was both singular and plural felt odd. Weirdly enough, this was about the time where you was beginning to be used in both singular and plural sense. Yes, you heard that right. Roses are red, violets are blue. Singular they has been around longer than singular you. In lieu of the challenge of singular they, writers continued to include singular they and them in their work, including Jane Austen in her 1813 novel Pride and Prejudice. Even today, we still use they, them, their in singular sense, even if we don't realize it. Take, for instance, you find a phone at the bus station. You might think to yourself, wow, I really hope whoever lost this finds their phone. I want to take a second to talk about who's affected by the controversy around the use of they, them, their pronouns, non-binary people. If you're watching this video, you may or may not be familiar with what non-binary means, but just in case you aren't familiar, let me help catch you up. In the West, we have this concept that there are only two sexes and or genders, male and female. And that whatever sex you are assigned at birth must mean that is the gender you identify with for the remainder of your life. That is what is seen as culturally normal or appropriate. But to that, I have some bad news. That's not how it works. For starters, sex and gender are two very separate concepts, with one being more biological and the other being more social, internal, cultural, and even spiritual. Even our language supports this. Gender roles is a perfect example of the difference. Different cultures have different roles for different genders, regardless of sex identified at birth, but more on that later. To recap thus far, non-binary and or genderqueer people tend to lie between or outside the two shades of masculinity and femininity, and typically use the following pronouns, which are all supported grammatically. Most of what I've talked about so far has been my personal experience here in the West, but I want to delve a little bit deeper into that and go outside the West, because believe it or not, the Western experience is not a universal experience. Not only that, but more often than not, culture and gender tend to be intersectional. Now, a lot of LGBTQ people in America might be familiar with Two-Spirit individuals. That is a gender identity specific to Native American culture. Now, there are a plethora of other cultures that do things very similarly and a little bit differently than that. And it's not just the Native American people that do it. There are tons of other cultures that do it. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Now, this is not going to be an extensive list, but it's just a little beginning, a good start. In Judaism, the parent religion of Christianity, they acknowledge upwards of 6 separate genders. Zakar roughly translates to male, Nekiva, which translates to female, androgynos, a person with male and female characteristics, Tumtum, a person whose sexual characteristics are indeterminate or obscured, Ailani, a person who is identified as female at birth but develops male characteristics, and Saris, a person who is identified male at birth but develops female characteristics. In Samoa, Fa'afafine are people assigned male at birth but raised as women. It roughly translates to the way of the woman. In Indonesia, they recognize 5 genders: male, female, Kalabi, people assigned male at birth but express feminine qualities, Kalale, people assigned female at birth but express masculine qualities, and Bisu, people embodying aspects of all genders. The intent of this video was to help in the liberation of non-binary folks, and specifically in educating folks on the non-Western, non-binary identities that exist and have always existed. Non-binary identities have always existed and will continue to exist throughout history. I am a non-binary white person in the United States, so if you have felt that I have spread some misinformation or possibly mispronounced something, please feel free to let me know. I feel that by talking about these kinds of things, we can help in the liberation of others and help in the decolonization work that is required here in the United States and in the West. Just a friendly reminder that non-binary identities are real and they are valid, and trans people will exist in the future. Thank you.